Judge Judy had watched people walk into her courtroom believing volume could replace truth. She had seen expensive suits hide dishonesty and trembling hands carry undeniable evidence, but even after thousands of cases, the courtroom fell into a silence unlike any other the moment Karen slammed both palms against the plaintiff's table and shouted, "I know my rights." The words echoed across the room with such force that even the bailiff instinctively shifted his stance. The plaintiff, an elderly bookstore owner named Margaret Collins, didn't answer. She simply tightened her grip on a worn brown folder that looked older than some of the people sitting in the gallery. One faded corner of that folder peeked open just enough to reveal a small handwritten note that no one else seemed to notice, no one except Judge Judy. She didn't interrupt Karen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. Instead, she quietly looked from Karen to that weathered folder and then back again. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the perfect time, because stories like this prove that the smallest courtroom moments often hide the biggest truths. Subscribe for more unforgettable courtroom dramas, and comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Stay with this one, because everything is about to change. What nobody realized was that this case wasn't destined to become unforgettable because someone yelled. It became unforgettable because of what Judge Judy already suspected before the first witness ever spoke. Pay close attention to every detail, because one ordinary piece of paper would soon dismantle an entire performance. Karen Dawson entered the courtroom with the confidence of someone convinced she had already won. Her designer handbag rested neatly beside her chair. Her expression carried the unmistakable smile of someone who believed rules existed only for other people. She never looked at Margaret, not once. Experienced judges learn something important after years on the bench. Innocent people usually watch the person they're speaking about. People hiding something often avoid looking at them entirely. Judge Judy noticed it immediately. Margaret, meanwhile, looked nothing like someone hungry for revenge. Her gray sweater had been carefully repaired near one sleeve. Her shoes showed years of careful use instead of neglect. The folder resting in her lap wasn't organized to impress anyone. It was organized because every document inside represented months of trying to be heard before she ever stepped inside a courtroom. Sometimes the smallest cases carry the heaviest truths. On paper, this looked almost laughably simple. Karen insisted Margaret had fabricated a service agreement after purchasing antique books from her family's estate business. According to Karen, there had never been any promise to deliver the remaining collection or refund the deposit. It was her mistake. Karen had written repeatedly in emails. She's confused. She doesn't remember correctly. She's trying to get free money. When someone cannot destroy the facts, they often try to destroy the person presenting them. Judge Judy had seen that strategy countless times. The courtroom clerk finished reading the case summary. Karen leaned back with folded arms and smiled again. "You'll see," she muttered loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "Some people think age earns sympathy." Margaret lowered her eyes. Not because she believed Karen, because she'd heard those words before. Judge Judy noticed that too. Real fear doesn't always tremble. Sometimes it sits perfectly still. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Judy reached toward the case file already waiting on her bench, not Margaret's folder, but another document that had quietly arrived before court began. She opened only the first page. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, just enough for the bailiff, who had worked beside her for years, to recognize that she had found something important. She closed the file again without saying a word. Karen smiled even wider, completely unaware. She mistook silence for agreement. That would become the biggest mistake of her day. Judge Judy slowly folded her hands together and finally looked directly at Karen. The courtroom held its breath, because everyone sensed those first calm words were about to determine far more than a disagreement over old books, and Karen still believed shouting about her rights was the strongest argument she had. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Judge Judy rested both hands on the bench, allowing the courtroom to sit with its own anticipation. She had learned long ago that people eager to control a room usually became uncomfortable when no one rushed to fill the silence. Karen shifted confidently in her chair, convinced she had already framed the story. Margaret simply waited. The difference between the two women could not have been clearer. "Mrs. Collins," Judge Judy said calmly, "tell me what happened. Start at the beginning." Margaret took a slow breath before speaking. "My husband collected rare first editions for 43 years, she said softly. After he passed away, I couldn't bear to sell them all at once. Karen told me she specialized in estate collections and promised she would handle everything honestly." She paused, gently running her fingers across the edge of the weathered folder. It wasn't just paper she was touching. It was memory. The narrator could almost feel the weight inside that old folder. Every receipt, every handwritten note, every carefully preserved email represented another attempt to protect something far more valuable than books. This case was never really about the money. The books represented a lifetimes spent with the man she loved. Each volume still carried small handwritten notes from her late husband tucked inside the covers. Anniversary messages, vacation memories, favorite passages they had read together on rainy evenings. Selling them had been one of the hardest decisions she had ever made. She had trusted someone she believed understood that Karen had presented herself as an expert in preserving family collections. She promised the books would be cataloged, professionally sold, and that Margaret would receive detailed records along with the remaining unsold collection. Instead, months passed. Ton calls stopped being returned. Emails became shorter, excuses became more creative. Finally, Karen claimed there had never been any written agreement beyond a simple purchase. The rest, she insisted, existed only in Margaret's imagination. When someone loses a loved one, the narrator explained, their memory often becomes the first thing dishonest people attack. Convince everyone the grieving person is confused, and suddenly every promise becomes easier to erase. Judge Judy listened without interrupting. She wasn't just hearing words, she was watching behavior. Margaret answered directly. She never exaggerated. She admitted when she couldn't remember exact dates. She corrected herself when she realized she had misspoken. Experienced judges notice that. People telling the truth are usually comfortable admitting what they don't know. People performing rarely leave gaps. Judge Judy's eyes drifted back toward the brown folder. "What do you have there?" she asked. Margaret carefully opened it. Inside sat dozens of neatly labeled envelopes, receipts, shipping confirmations, drip-tinted emails, photographs, and resting between two transparent sleeves, a single handwritten bookmark. It looked ordinary, just a strip of thick cream-colored paper. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. Judge Judy looked at it for only a second before returning her attention to Margaret. "What is that?" Margaret smiled for the first time all morning. "My husband's handwriting." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. He used it in whichever book he was reading. "Karen told me everything from his library had been inventoried, but somehow that bookmark came back inside one shipment." Judge Judy nodded once. She didn't explain why that answer interested her. Not yet. Bodies confess before mouths do. Karen had remained relaxed through every receipt and email. But the moment Margaret mentioned the bookmark, Karen blinked twice. Quickly, almost imperceptibly. Then she reached for her bottle of water. The narrator paused on that tiny movement. Small reactions often reveal large fears. Judge Judy noticed it too. She made no comment. Instead, she asked another simple question. "Mrs. Collins, approximately how many books were involved?" 412. "And how many were returned?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "Only 38. Karen laughed under her breath. "It wasn't my responsibility to babysit sentimental junk." Several people in the gallery looked toward her in disbelief. Judge Judy didn't react outwardly, but inside the courtroom, something invisible had shifted. Because arrogance has a way of speaking before evidence ever does. Margaret quietly reached deeper into the folder. This time she removed an unopened white envelope. Its seal had never been broken. Across the front, written in fading blue ink, were 6 words: "Only open if something goes wrong." Judge Judy stared at the envelope for several long seconds. Karen's confident smile began to tighten. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked genuinely nervous, and no one yet understood why one unopened envelope had suddenly become the most important object in the entire courtroom. Karen's fingers remained wrapped around the unopened bottle of water, but she never twisted the cap. That tiny hesitation told Judge Judy more than another 5 minutes of testimony ever could. People who believe they control a situation rarely fear ordinary objects. But the moment an object carries a history they cannot rewrite, confidence begins to crack. The white envelope rested quietly on the plaintiff's table. It had not been opened. It had not been introduced as evidence, yet somehow it had already become the center of the courtroom. Karen finally broke the silence with a dismissive laugh. "Oh, come on. We're seriously doing this?" she scoffed. "An old envelope. This is exactly why we're wasting everyone's time." The courtroom remained still. Judge Judy didn't respond. She simply turned another page in the case file that had been waiting on her bench before either party walked into court. Karen mistook that silence for approval. She smiled again. That smile would not last much longer. The narrator watched the subtle shift in Karen's posture. She no longer leaned comfortably against her chair. Instead, she leaned forward, as though trying to control where everyone's attention landed. Experienced judges recognize that behavior. When someone starts directing attention away from evidence that hasn't even been discussed, they often know exactly what that evidence might reveal. Judge Judy finally looked up. "Miss Dawson," she said calmly, "tell me about your business." Karen answered immediately. "I've been handling estate collections for almost 12 years. Hundreds of satisfied clients. Antique dealers know me all over the state." Her voice carried polished confidence. She spoke without hesitation. "I organize inventories, arrange private collectors, negotiate prices, and make sure families get fair value." Judge Judy nodded once. "You've never had complaints?" Karen smiled. "Not legitimate ones." The answer arrived too quickly. "Bodies confess before mouths do." Judge Judy had noticed something else. Every time Karen described herself, she looked directly at the judge. Every time Margaret was mentioned, Karen looked away. That mattered. People comfortable with the truth rarely avoid looking at the person accusing them. Karen continued speaking before another question could be asked. "Mrs. Collins is grieving. I understand that. But grief affects memory. She's mixing conversations together and blaming me because the books didn't sell the way she hoped." Margaret quietly lowered her eyes, not from shame, from exhaustion. The narrator understood what Judge Judy was already seeing. Karen wasn't defending her paperwork. She was attacking Margaret's credibility. When someone cannot erase evidence, they often try to erase the witness. Judge Judy folded her hands together. "So your position," she asked evenly, "is that Mrs. Collins simply imagined promises that never existed?" "Exactly, and every email she submitted, taken out of context. The receipts, they don't prove anything. The inventory logs, incomplete. The photographs, anyone can stage photographs." Karen answered every question with growing confidence. Each response sounded rehearsed. Each answer became broader. Each denial covered more ground. Liars often rehearse words. They forget to rehearse restraint. Judge Judy glanced briefly toward the unopened envelope before returning her attention to Karen. "You seem very certain I am." Karen straightened her jacket. "Because facts are facts." The narrator noticed something almost no one else did. Margaret never once interrupted. She never rolled her eyes. She never whispered. She simply held that old folder as though it contained the last conversation she had ever shared with her husband. Sometimes dignity is quieter than victory. Judge Judy finally leaned back. "I have one concern. Karen smiled confidently. Of course you do. You've repeatedly described yourself as someone who documents everything. I do. You claim your records are complete. They are. You insist nothing was promised beyond a standard purchase agreement. Correct. And you're prepared to stand by every one of those statements under oath? Karen didn't hesitate. Absolutely. The courtroom seemed almost relieved by how certain she sounded. But Judge Judy wasn't watching Karen's face anymore. She was watching Karen's hands. The right thumb had begun rubbing nervously against the edge of the water bottle. Back and forth, again, and again. Tiny movements often tell bigger stories than loud voices. Judge Judy closed the file in front of her with deliberate care. Then she looked directly at Karen. Interesting. Only one word, nothing more. Yet the confidence in Karen's expression flickered for the first time. She frowned. What does that mean? Judge Judy didn't answer. Instead, she reached toward the unopened white envelope resting beside Margaret. The gallery leaned forward almost as one. Even the bailiff shifted his weight. Karen's confident smile disappeared completely. Wait, she said, her voice noticeably quieter than before. You don't even know what's inside that envelope. Judge Judy looked at her without blinking. No, she paused. But judging by your reaction, another long silence filled the courtroom. I believe you do. Karen's face drained of color. For the first time since she had shouted, I know my rights. The woman who believed she controlled the courtroom found herself unable to say a single word, and Judge Judy's hand came to rest on the sealed envelope, preparing to reveal what Karen had been hoping would remain hidden forever. Judge Judy did not lift the envelope immediately. She let her fingertips rest on its worn edge as though the paper itself deserved the same patience she had denied countless liars over the years. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Even the soft hum of the overhead lights suddenly seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Karen swallowed. You can't possibly know what that is, she said, forcing a nervous laugh. It could be anything. Judge Judy looked up without changing her expression. You're absolutely right. She paused. It could. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Experienced judges understand something most people never learn. Evidence rarely frightens dishonest people. Unto-known evidence does. The narrator watched Karen carefully. The woman who had entered the courtroom declaring she knew her rights now seemed desperate to know what Judge Judy knew. Her confidence wasn't disappearing because of facts already introduced. It was disappearing because she could no longer predict what would happen next. Judge Judy turned toward Margaret. Mrs. Collins, who wrote this message? Margaret looked at the envelope for a long moment before answering. My husband. And why didn't you open it? Because he asked me not to unless something went wrong. Her voice cracked only slightly. I kept hoping nothing would. The courtroom became impossibly quiet. Sometimes hope survives much longer than trust. Judge Judy carefully examined the faded handwriting across the front. The ink had aged naturally. The folds were old. Nothing about it appeared freshly prepared. Karen shifted uneasily. That proves absolutely nothing, she interrupted. People write sentimental notes all the time. Judge Judy slowly raised one eyebrow. No one has claimed it proves anything. Karen immediately realized her mistake. She had begun arguing against evidence before anyone knew what it contained. The narrator could almost feel the mood changing inside the courtroom. People who think they've already won often reveal their greatest fear too early. Judge Judy placed the envelope back on the bench. She still didn't open it. Instead, she reached for another document from her own file. Mrs. Dawson, she said calmly, you testified that your business keeps complete inventory records. Yes, you also testified that every book received from Mrs. Collins was properly documented. Correct. And you stand by that? I already said I do. Judge Judy nodded once. Good. She slid a single sheet of paper across the bench toward Karen. I'd like you to read the highlighted line. Karen picked it up confidently. Within seconds, her smile vanished. The narrator noticed her eyes moving back to the same sentence again and again. She wasn't reading anymore. She was searching for a way out. Judge Judy remained silent. Finally, Karen looked up. "Where did you get this?" "I'll ask the questions." Karen hesitated. It isn't the complete document." "No?" Judge Judy folded her hands. "Then tell everyone what part is missing." Karen stared at the page without speaking. The bailiff glanced toward Judge Judy. Even he sensed the pressure building. Bodies confess before mouths do. Karen's breathing had become noticeably faster. One hand remained on the document. The other still clutched the unopened water bottle. She had never taken a single drink before this next reveal. Comment below. What do you think is inside that sealed envelope? Or, if you already sense where this case is headed, comment justice. The answer is closer than anyone in that courtroom realizes. Judge Judy let the engagement of the courtroom settle before continuing. "You claimed Mrs. Collins imagined additional promises." "Yes." "You claimed there was never any written agreement beyond a basic purchase." "Yes." "You claimed every inventory record supports your version." "Yes." Judge Judy leaned forward slightly. "And yet," she tapped the highlighted paragraph. "This document appears to reference a secondary inventory." Karen's face turned pale. There were working notes. Working notes? They weren't official, so they existed. Karen froze. The words had escaped before she could stop them. The courtroom reacted immediately. Margaret slowly closed her eyes, not in celebration, in relief. Judge Judy didn't smile. She simply observed. Liars often believe the dangerous question is the complicated one. It rarely is. The dangerous question is the simple one they never expected. Karen quickly tried to recover. "I mean, everyone makes temporary lists." Judge Judy remained composed. Interesting. She reached beneath the bench. This time she wasn't reaching for the envelope. She was reaching for a sealed evidence sleeve that had been waiting there since before court had begun. Inside rested a small flash drive and a folded inventory sheet bearing the same estate reference number Karen had denied existed. Karen's shoulders visibly dropped. The gallery leaned forward. Margaret's weathered folder suddenly made sense. The unopened envelope had distracted everyone, but Judge Judy had been building a ladder of proof all along. The envelope held one truth. The flash drive promised another. And the inventory sheet threatened to destroy everything Karen had sworn under oath. Judge Judy held the sealed evidence sleeve without a trace of drama. She didn't wave it in the air. She didn't make a speech. She simply placed it on the bench beside the unopened envelope. The contrast was striking. One object had belonged to the past. The other had arrived through modern evidence. Together, they told a story neither side had fully revealed. Karen stared at the flash drive as though it had appeared out of nowhere. Her breathing became shallow. What is that?" she asked. Judge Judy answered without looking up. "Evidence." Only one word, nothing more. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Truth does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, waiting for the right moment. Judge Judy nodded toward the court technician. "Please display the contents." Within seconds, the courtroom monitor came to life. A spreadsheet filled the screen. Every line listed a book from Margaret Collins' late husband's collection, title, edition, condition, purchase price, estimated resale value, and beside dozens of entries, a column labeled * private hold. * Karen's eyes widened. Judge Judy spoke softly. "Do you recognize this inventory?" Karen hesitated. It looks familiar. Interesting. A few moments earlier, Karen had insisted no secondary inventory had ever existed. Now it merely looked familiar. Experienced judges notice when certainty quietly becomes uncertainty. Judge Judy turned another page. Let's continue. The technician opened another file from the flash drive. This time, photographs appeared. Not photographs submitted by Margaret. These had been taken inside Karen's own warehouse. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Each shelf carried inventory tags. Several rare first editions from Margaret's collection were clearly visible. But something else caught everyone's attention. Every book marked asterisk private hold had a second price tag attached. The amounts were dramatically higher than the values Karen had reported to Margaret. The courtroom stirred. Margaret covered her mouth. She wasn't shocked because the books had value. She was shocked because her instincts had been right all along. This had never been poor bookkeeping. It had been deliberate. Judge Judy calmly folded her hands. Ms. Dawson, Karen remained silent. Were these books reported to Mrs. Collins as unsold? Karen swallowed. Yes. Judge Judy looked toward the monitor. And yet your inventory classified them as private holdings reserved for preferred collectors. Karen searched desperately for an explanation. They were still under evaluation. Judge Judy asked the next question so quietly that everyone leaned forward to hear it. For 11 months? Karen froze. Silence. Real fear does not always shake. Sometimes it cannot answer. The narrator watched the courtroom transform before his eyes. The woman who had entered laughing now looked trapped by her own records. Judge Judy reached for one final document. This report was voluntarily provided by your own software vendor after receiving a lawful records request. Karen's face lost what little color remained. It includes timestamps. The technician opened another file. Every inventory change appeared in chronological order. Original entry, updated value, private hold designation, time user account. Each modification had been made using Karen's personal login credentials. There was nowhere left to hide. No assistant accessed the account, Judge Judy said. No employee made these changes. She looked directly at Karen. You did. Karen finally tried one last defense. I was protecting the collection until market prices improved. Judge Judy didn't blink. With whose permission? Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence answered for her. Then Judge Judy picked up the weathered white envelope. For the first time all morning, she opened it. Inside rested a single folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Margaret immediately recognized her husband's handwriting. Judge Judy unfolded it carefully and read only the portion relevant to the case. If anything happens to me before our collection is sold, she read. Every book is to remain fully inventoried, every sale documented, and no title withheld without my wife's written approval. Trust is worth more than every volume on these shelves. The courtroom fell completely silent. Margaret's tears finally came, not because of the books, not because of the money, because the final promise her husband had left behind had survived long enough to protect her when no one else could. Karen lowered her head. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she could not meet Judge Judy's eyes. The confidence that had filled the room only an hour earlier had completely disappeared. Judge Judy quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. The evidence is complete, she said, and I have heard enough. Karen closed her eyes. She already knew the verdict was no longer something she could argue her way out of. The only thing left was to hear the words that would change her reputation forever. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of Judge Judy placing the letter back inside the envelope seemed to echo across the room. Karen no longer sat with her shoulders back. The woman who had walked into court declaring, "I know my rights," now stared at the table in front of her, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Judge Judy allowed the silence to settle. She had never believed justice required shouting. Sometimes the truth carried enough weight on its own. She looked directly at Karen. Rights protect honest people, she said calmly. They do not erase responsibility. Karen finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for it to go this far. Judge Judy's expression never changed. It didn't. She paused. You took it this far the moment you decided someone else's grief was a business opportunity. The courtroom remained motionless. Even the bailiff seemed unwilling to interrupt the moment. The narrator understood what everyone else was beginning to realize. This case had never truly been about rare books. It had been about trust. Margaret had entrusted Karen with the final collection her late husband had spent decades building. Karen hadn't merely mishandled inventory. She had manipulated records, withheld property, and repeatedly attempted to convince the court that a grieving widow's memory was the problem instead of her own conduct. Judge Judy reviewed the evidence one final time. The photographs establish possession. The digital inventory establishes control. The software records establish intentional alterations, and your own testimony established contradictions you could not explain. She folded her hands. The evidence speaks far more clearly than your excuses. Karen slowly wiped tears from her face. I'm sorry. Judge Judy looked at her for several long seconds. There is a difference between regret and accountability. Another silence, then came the ruling. Judgment is entered in favor of Mrs. Margaret Collins. The gallery collectively exhaled. Judge Judy continued. You will immediately return every remaining book identified in this inventory that is still in your possession. You will pay damages for the documented losses supported by the evidence presented. And because the inventory records suggest conduct extending beyond this single transaction, copies of today's exhibits will be made available to the appropriate consumer protection authorities for whatever review they consider appropriate. Karen closed her eyes. Her shoulders dropped. She understood what those words meant. This courtroom could decide the civil dispute before it. But the consequences outside this courtroom had only begun. Judge Judy looked at Karen one final time before concluding. Then she delivered words that no one in that room would ever forget. When you steal someone's trust, every lie afterward becomes evidence against your own character. No one spoke. No one moved. The sentence hung over the courtroom like a final verdict that reached beyond legal paperwork. Margaret quietly pressed the old envelope against her chest. She wasn't crying because she had won money. She wasn't smiling because Karen had lost. She was emotional because, after months of being told she was confused, forgetful, and imagining promises that never existed, someone had finally believed her. Sometimes justice is not loud. Sometimes it is simply hearing a judge say, I believe the evidence. As the parties prepared to leave, Karen hesitated near the courtroom door. She turned back toward Margaret. I'm sorry. This time the apology sounded different. There was no confidence left, no performance. Only the unmistakable weight of consequences. Margaret gave a small, respectful nod. She didn't celebrate. She didn't insult Karen. She simply picked up the worn brown folder, tucked the unopened, now opened letter safely inside, and walked out carrying something she thought she had lost forever, her dignity. Over the following days, word of the case spread throughout the local community of collectors and estate professionals. Several former clients contacted consumer protection officials after recognizing similar irregularities in their own transactions. Businesses that had once referred customers to Karen quietly removed her name from their recommendation lists, pending further review. Meanwhile, Margaret returned the recovered books to the shelves her husband had built by hand. She placed his handwritten bookmark inside his favorite first edition. The letter returned to the same folder where it had rested for years. But now it represented something entirely different, not a warning, a promise fulfilled. The narrator offered one final reflection. Truth rarely arrives with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. More often, it hides inside an old folder, a forgotten inventory, or a letter written by someone who simply hoped the right person would someday read it. Arrogance may dominate a room for a few moments. Evidence can change it forever. If this story reminded you that integrity still matters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more unforgettable courtroom stories, and share it with someone who believes truth is always worth defending. Then leave a comment below telling us what moment changed your opinion of Karen the most.